Demkovich's retreat and mission for the parish as we make our journey to Jerusalem. Father Demkovich.
You know, the gift of what our faith means, the gift of the Scriptures, allow us to enter into a reality. And so these nights, by looking at the passages from the Scripture that are journey stories, are ones for us as we continue our Lenten journey to allow the Spirit of God to take shape within. Tonight, as Father said, it's the journey to Jerusalem. And just that reality. This is the moment when Jesus turns his face to fulfill the will of the Father. It is a moment for us in our faith journey to encounter our living the Father's will. This journey is a challenging one, for it confronts the will of the Father and our struggle to understand God's will for us. There is a certain sense of poverty and obedience, both poverty and obedience, which are hallmarks of this journey. Mark writes of Jesus telling his disciples of his destiny, his passion, and yet they journey to Jerusalem with him. The scripture passage this evening is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, 32 to 34. As I said last night, if you have a Bible with you, great. If you have a smartphone, just Google Mark 10, 32 to 34, and magically it will appear. This is the third time that Jesus foretells his death and resurrection from the Gospel of Mark. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside and again began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again." This journey truly does draw us into the reality of poverty and obedience. That sense of needing and obeying. As professed religious know, these two vows are significant in shaping their lives. Apostolic poverty, that sense of holding all things in common, demands a fuller sense of obedience. And true obedience comes not from power, but from poverty. The call to mendicant poverty isn't about denial, but rather it is about dependency. Now, sometimes spiritual lessons translate from consecrated religious life to everyone living the Christian life. I recall in my novitiate year, one of my brother novices, who's no longer with us, had a sense of poverty as destitution. and that everyone else was not destitute enough. He prided himself on how he was living poverty. But the fact of the matter was, he was a very stingy person. Let's think about that. Poverty isn't about being stingy. Poverty is about a generosity. Poverty that lacks generosity, no matter how meager our means, is a flawed understanding of poverty. True poverty frees us to be generous, not just with our treasures, but with our time and talents as well. Religious choose to be poor, not as some Spartan badge of spiritual superiority, but simply to give witness. We all choose apostolic simplicity, to allow our lack, our needs to be known, to place before the world our vulnerability, our need for them, and for others whose charity and kindness may blossom. I think this is extremely important when we encounter the poor. The poor in our midst are placing before us their needs. And it is an opportunity, an opening for us to flourish in our generosity. But so too in our relationships to and with one another. When we're vulnerable, when we're open, that sense of poverty opens to another an opportunity for generosity. So the poverty of a poor one is always met with the generosity of God's gifts bestowed to others. For you see, it's only in our surrendering ownership that we find we are dependent upon others and dependent upon God. It is only out of poverty of will, a surrender, that I am called to truly obey. When I become obedient, the gracious gift of God is bestowed. Now, in saying this, I will confess that the lived reality of professed obedience is not easy. It's tough to do what a superior expects you to do or tells you to do. But all of us in our lives meet in those moments of obedience a surrender of our will to a will that's far greater. We trust the goodness of God's will. It isn't always easy to surrender and trust. All of us know that. We just need to look at our society and how difficult it is for us to truly trust one another. And this is especially true if the soil of a person in their life hasn't been enriched and allowed to grow with generosity. Now, I have heard many religious women and men, and what I've heard from them I find to be horror stories in one sense, because what they're dealing with is a lack of trust. For too long in their life, the blistering heat of hurts made barren their soul's soil. We can pick at our wounds, and in that sense, we lose a sense of trust. Trust requires of us a vulnerability and an openness. So for these people, trust was a seed that could not and would not take root. So too for many of us. For many of us. Those grudges we've held on to. Those old hurts that we keep bringing up time and time again. our unwillingness to forgive someone who's offended us. Now, one Dominican, Dominicans are always happy to tell you what they think. One Dominican told me on this issue of obedience and religious obedience to their superior that he was very, very fortunate because all of his superiors were educable. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said, I was able to reteach them. Unfortunately, I've had some superiors who, one might say, were a bit less educable. My point is that both poverty and obedience require trust. Require trust. And the journey to Jerusalem helps us to discover what this means in our life. To trust the will of the Father. To trust the will of the Father. Now, I'm reminded of a story. A man feared his wife wasn't hearing as well as she used to, and he thought she might need a hearing aid. Not quite sure what to do, he called the family doctor, who gave a simple test to do. He said, stand about 40 feet away from her and in a normal, conversational speaking tone. See if she hears you. If not, go to 30 feet, then 20 feet, and so on, until you get a response. That evening, his wife was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and he was in the next room. He said to himself, I'm about 40 feet away. Let's see what happens. Then in a normal tone, he asked, honey, what's for dinner? No response. So he moved closer to the kitchen and repeated, honey, what's for dinner? Still no response. Next, he moved into the dining room where he was about 20 feet away from his wife and asked, honey, what's for dinner? Again, he got no response. So he walked up to the kitchen door, about 10 feet away. Honey, what's for dinner? Again, there was no response. So he walked up right behind her. Honey, what's for dinner? Herman, for the 5th time, chicken! Often, we think the problem is theirs. When it's really our own. When it's really our own. Poverty and obedience complement one another. Only when we realize our lack, our need, can we obey, genuinely hear the will of God at work in our life. Now, much was written, especially after World War II, on duty and the danger of blind obedience. True obedience is never an excuse to forego the moral virtues. Even religious superiors are bound by obedience to the rule of life, and for many communities, it is through the voice of the chapter or the voice of the community. It is in this obedience that we discover both our abilities and our needs. Both abilities and needs must always be assessed in the light of truth and of goodness. Abilities and needs are measured by truth and by goodness. Honesty and charity seem to me to be the fruits of obedience and poverty. A community, a family's genuineness, and its generosity are found when we, like Herman in the story, realize the issue is our own. This, I confess, can be a lifelong journey to accept that the issue is mine. The struggle is mine. Now, the passage we saw from Mark begins with the simple but important phrase, and they were on the road. And they were on the road. Being on the road, this in via, the Latin, in via, on the way, captures life and movement. Now, when I first thought about these talks and using these stories of journey, I initially referred to them as being on the road until one friend asked if Bob Hope and Bing Crosby were anywhere in my talks. Now, for those of you who are young, that's a reference to a series of old movies which were on the road with those actors. Needless to say, journey became the focus. But that does not take away from the reality of our being in via. It is a journey, a pilgrimage. The moment you feel as though your life has come to a standstill, you've abandoned the journey. You've abandoned God's call. It is a life that is on the road. And it is on the road of life that we encounter God. It is an encounter because of the journey. Now, when I lived in Kansas before coming here, there was a part which I found to be remarkably hilly. I always thought Kansas was the Kansas from The Wizard of Oz and it was all flat. But there are parts of Kansas which are really quite hilly. There was, to my surprise, too, a large wilderness area called the Flint Hills. I live near the Flint Hills. It is one of the largest national prairie grass areas in the United States. Grasslands that the early settlers would have found. These grasses can grow to be 8 to 10 feet tall. Just imagine that. And the winds create beautiful waves of deep green. Now, one spring day, I hiked one of these trails, and these grasses were just beginning to grow. They were already about 1 to 2 feet tall. Everywhere, there were all sorts of wildflowers. But the important thing that I want to share is what it meant for me to be on foot, a pedestrian walking in the wilderness. Of course, there was the initial excitement as you begin feeling, this isn't that tough. At the beginning, the road bends and crosses a stream. The path ambles through some woods on fairly level ground. And then there was a slight rise as the trees almost formed the gateway. It was magical. As I reached the top of this enchanted portal, I was confronted with a choice. Before me, the road seemed to go on and on and on in an almost direct ascent to the top of the high ridge. Now, my first thought was, I should just turn around, go back to the car. But pride told me to go on, as well as the voice of my doctor's exhortation to exercise. so I went on. I was passed by young, fit hikers. I hated them. More often than not, they were passing me by, but also I noted that there were still others farther behind me, which encouraged me on. Once I reached the top, the trail turned and followed along the hill atop a ridge. The grass meadow on one side and the river valley on the other. I recall thinking, I feel like I'm hiking in the Highlands of Scotland. Yes, I am a bit of a romantic. Then the road curved and began to descend. The heat of the day, the dust of the road, made me again wonder if I was doing the right thing. My only consolation was that I told myself it was now probably shorter to go forward than to turn back. The journey to Jerusalem is a journey of commitment, of obedience. It is one of going forward, of realizing that one's will must surrender to the ultimate end, the divine will of the Father. The disciples who walked the way with Jesus were confused. How could this man go to a place of such danger? They were afraid, but they continued on. There is something spiritually beneficial when we realize that faith is the antidote and remedy for fear. Faith is the antidote and remedy for fear. Gabriel's greeting to Mary at the Annunciation, the heavenly choir's greeting to the shepherds in the field, were both the same. Fear not. A person of faith is not foolishly fearless, but rather knows that fear serves a purpose. It is not an end. Fear raises our awareness. It heightens our sense, and it can either scare us away or empower us to carry on. Cowardice and courage are both born out of fear. Cowardice and courage are both born out of our fear. Again, it is at this moment that poverty and obedience confront us. Our fears about what Eckhart called niche, nothing, the not, what we lack or don't have, confront the obedience that tells us to do it, to obey. The journey to Jerusalem is one in which we know that ahead there is danger. Yet even though there is danger, from somewhere we encounter the small voice that calls us on. All of us know the hesitancy and uncertainty that can paralyze us. I have great sympathy for those in leadership who have been entrusted with the common good of our future, but must make decisions, almost always being second-guessed by well-meaning armchair experts. It is so much easier to acquiesce, to give in to fear and uncertainty, and cling to the status quo. His own disciples more or less said, Jesus, let's just turn back and spend our lives safely and quietly at home. Clearly, the disciples harbored such doubts. However, Jesus doesn't turn back. He doesn't revert to the old, but instead he offers us the new. a new promise and a new hope, our converting to the divine will of the Father. I have to say that this passage in Mark, I take and find great comfort in how Jesus dealt with the fearful 12 disciples. He took them and spoke to them of what was ahead. Imagine what this meant to hear blow by blow of what was to come. It was the obedience of the Son to the divine will of the Father. The obedience of the Son to the divine will of the Father. Yes, but it was more. It was the ultimate voluntary poverty to surrender himself to sinful man. To surrender himself to sinful humanity and thereby bring salvation. This kenosis in Greek, or self-emptying, is what the journey to Jerusalem teaches us. In the spiritual life, the hardest journey is when we turn our feet to Jerusalem, the future that we fear. It can be an assignment by a superior or a boss, election to an office we don't know if we could handle, or illness, or aging, or uncertain financial futures, or a world that seems to have gone mad. The journey to Jerusalem is perhaps the most significant journey in this life, for it enables us to hear the voice of the Lord calling us to obey. Thy will be done. Now allow me to finish my hiking story. The trail went on quite a bit further, a lot farther than I thought. I was tired and exhausted and just scarcely made it back before a rainstorm hit. And let me tell you, storms in Kansas City can be quite the experience. Like the journey to Jerusalem, my hike has been better understood, more fully appreciated after it was done. Sometimes the rear view of life is more important than what's looking ahead. These kinds of journeys are best appreciated in the past perfect tense of life. To have had. I'll give you a little bit of grammar there. Past perfect. To have had. Rather than in the present tense. Because the present tense cannot do it justice. Reflecting upon life is the best way to reap its harvest. Reflecting on life is the best way to reap its harvest. Or as Socrates said, the unexamined life is simply not worth living. Now at this moment, I want you to come to the end of this journey, but then to ponder. This is a time to reflect, a time to enter into a prayerful kind of disposition. So I want you to relax again. Don't fall asleep on me. Just relax, maybe jiggle yourself a little. Get kind of a breathing, pay attention to your breathing, and enter into a bit of prayer as I offer these meditations. Here we've come to the end of the journey. Take a moment to review the fearful journeys in your own life. Those times of challenge and change. For those of us who have been around, starting a new career, getting fired from a job, having to make a move, facing an illness, divorce, or death, all of these are part of the journey to Jerusalem. But the young, too, face this journey in the brokenheartedness of dating, in the sense of failure, born of exams, or dead-end jobs. It is in this journey that obedience and dedication take shape. Think about it. It is a time of surrendering to the will of the Father. They are uncertain times, but at the same instant, they are about salvation and redemption. It is a journey of obedience to the Father. Jerusalem is the place of redemptive suffering, a suffering that brings about hope and healing. Golgotha, the empty tomb. Pay close attention to the fear that lingers in your heart. Mockery that leaves us feeling demeaned. The dehumanizing sense of being spat upon. The searing pain of being flogged. Or the ultimate annihilation of murder. Each of us, to varying degrees, knows these realities of the road to Jerusalem. Allow your heart to face them. In poverty of soul and obedience of will, look within. For only the shroud is left if we obey the divine will. As the disciples journeyed with Jesus, facing their challenges, they asked him how to pray. In response, we see in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 6, a prayer of poverty and obedience, of trust and mercy. The Our Father is the perfect prayer for the journey to Jerusalem. So to conclude then, let us stand and together pray the prayer that Christ has given and taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Tomorrow is the last of the mission days, and at 9:30 after the Mass here at 8:30 in the Parish Community Center will be the last presentation on the virtue of love. So we looked at faith, hope, and love. And tomorrow evening it'll be the journey of Emmaus, that journey of discipleship. So again, I am delighted to see all of you here. Allow yourselves to take whatever you can. I'm noticing that a number of you have chosen to do the 6-pack, so you're going to all 6 of these, I think. So brave souls that you are. Brave souls that you are. Also, at some point, there'll be flyers or brochures tomorrow. So, and I'm sure for the rest of the week we'll be able to get them. These journeys are based upon the book that I've written, We Walk by Faith. And so there are 7 of these similar kind of journeys. It almost allows you to do a personal retreat on your own. So that's kind of an unashamed sale pitch. The Lord be with you. The Almighty God bless us, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let us go in peace to journey with our Lord. Thank you.